a pattern of anesthetic deaths consistent with an autosomal dominant trait running in families in Australia. So he started working out this and found the term like called malignant hypothermia. And they found halothane and succinylcholine are two of the most potent triggers of malignant hypothermia. Because of choice of anesthetic, a neuromuscular blocker influences the course of this potentially lethal syndrome. Malignant hypothermia is a disease of particular concern to pediatric anesthesiologists who chooses to administer these drugs. So coming to physiology, when a muscle gets stimulated, there will be propagation of action potential in motor nerve fiber, which causes depolarization. That depolarization release acetylcholine from the neuromuscular junction, which causes when the acetylcholine releases, it reacts with the receptor and it opens up channel. So when the channel opens, sodium enters the channel and potassium flows out, which causes depolarization at sarcolemma, and that depolarization spreads internally via the transverse tubules that abut onto the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So the walls of transverse tubule, one second. The walls of transverse tubule has a receptor called dihydropyridine receptor. It reacts with the ryanodine receptor and it releases calcium into the sarcoplasm from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So sarcoplasmic reticulum is the major storage site of calcium. Increased calcium in the sarcoplasm also induces further calcium release from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So one side the calcium will be entering and other side the calcium will be exiting from the sarcoplasm. So when the calcium is depleted, there is something called SOS, that is store operated calcium entry, that allows calcium entry into the sarcoplasm from extracellular milieu. The other routine thing is excitation coupled calcium entry, which is ECCE. In that, extracellular calcium enters the sarcoplasm through plasma membrane after depolarization. The ryanodine receptor 1 has influence on both SOCE and ECCE. This mechanism is of important when we give a drug which is used for malignant hypothermia. So ryanodine receptor 1 is a homotetrameric channel regulated by ions, small molecules, and proteins. So coming to pathophysiology of malignant hypothermia, what happens is there is some mutation in the ryanodine receptor and that causes altered calcium release channel protein. Because of that mutation in the ryanodine receptor, the mutated channel opens and there will be flooding of calcium in the sarcoplasm. So what happens? The high intracellular levels of calcium stimulate sustained release, sustained muscle contraction that causes rigidity. And because of high calcium, it also stimulates breakdown of glycogen. It causes glycolysis, aerobic metabolism. So there'll be extreme heat production, uncontrolled muscle contraction, hypothermia, and rhabdomyolysis. So these are the clinical events that occur during malignant hypothermia. First is because of hypermetabolism, there will be increased oxygen consumption and the respiratory rate will be increased, which is the cause for respiratory acidosis we were talking about. So another thing is there will be raised EtCO2 more than 55 millimeter of mercury. There will be total body rigidity, masseter spasm, inappropriate sinus tachycardia, ventricular fibrillation or ventricular tachycardia, and temperature rises more than 1.5 degree in 5 minutes. And there will be profuse sweating, motile or cyanotic skin, and cola-colored urine. If two or more symptoms present and which determines blood PCO2, PO2, base excess, lactate, potassium ions, creatine phosphokinase, and myoglobin, and consider discontinuing the triggering agents. If temperature is more than 40 degrees Celsius, we should check for clotting function and serum creatinine also. If total body rigidity is present without a neurologic explanation, we should send for blood for laboratory evaluation as mentioned above, and discontinue the triggering agent, begin treatment for acute malignant hypothermia episode. So what will be the positive findings consistent with malignant hypothermia? One is venous PCO2 more than 65 millimeter of mercury, with increased minute ventilation. That is because of the increased minute ventilation is because of increased respiratory rate. Arterial PCO2 more than 60 millimeter of mercury or 65 millimeter of mercury with spontaneous ventilation greater than normal. Arterial base excess more negative than -8 milliequivalents per liter. Arterial pH less than 7.25. Potassium ion more than 6 milliequivalent per liter. Creatinine kinase more than 10,000 international unit per liter after anesthetized with succinylcholine. Myoglobin in urine more than 170 microgram per liter, and myoglobin in urine more than 60 microgram. During malignant hyperthermia episode, there's something called masseter spasm is happening. So what is masseter spasm? Masseter spasm, it is also termed as masseter muscle rigidity or trismus, is marked increase in tension of masseter that prevents opening of mouth when succinylcholine has produced neuromuscular blockade. Masseter spasm is the earliest sign of malignant hyperthermia. This has occurred after administration of succinylcholine in malignant hyperthermia susceptible patients without other signs of malignant hyperthermia also. However, succinylcholine also produces increased tension in normal muscle at the same time that it produces block of neuromuscular transmission. In this condition, they state that the mouth cannot be fully opened even with firm pressure on the incisor, but the mouth can be opened far enough to permit intubation of trachea. The only difference in trismus is the mouth cannot be opened enough to permit intubation of trachea. So how will we manage this masseter spasm? If the jaw stiffness is mild, mouth can be opened means opened with increased effort. There is no rigidity in the rest of the body and cardiovascular function is stable. Anesthesia may be continued with careful documentation of capnography and core temperature. Fluid deficit should be replaced completely. So urine output is greater than 3 ml per kg per hour. If the jaw stiffness is severe, there are several reasons to terminate the elective anesthetic administration, not at the least of which may be the need to clear the upper airway. Core temperature must be monitored and cooling applied as indicated. If the rigidity persists in the presence of neuromuscular blockade, either the patient has malignant hyperthermia or much less common muscular disorder. So what are the treatment of acute episode of malignant hyperthermia? The first and foremost thing we have to do is stop all the triggering anesthetic agents immediately. And we should administer dantrolene. We are going to discuss about dantrolene in the forthcoming slides. And we should call for help definitely at any emergencies. And we should flush the anesthesia circuit for 90 seconds. Increase minute ventilation several fold with oxygen at 10 liter per minute. We should insert charcoal filter on the inspiratory and expiratory limbs of gas delivery circuit after replacing the circuit and breathing back. We should alert the surgeon that the procedure must be concluded promptly. If core temperature is higher than 39 degrees Celsius, cooling measures should be applied until the temperature is below 38 degrees Celsius. If malignant hyperthermia occurs after the first hour of exposure to inhalation anesthetic, there is a substantial anesthetic triggering agent in the patient's body. So we have to do the next steps. The procedures to cool the body should be instituted quickly. The goal is to reduce muscle metabolism and avoid exposure to critical core temperature of greater than 40.5 degrees Celsius. The drape should be removed immediately. Heated humidifiers and hot air blowers should be turned off. Water mattresses should be turned into cooling temperature. Balanced salt solution should be administered intravenously to maintain normal central venous pressure. The stomach can be irrigated with iced saline solution through an orogastric tube. Open body cavities, if the surgeon has opened any cavities, the open body cavities also can be lavaged with iced saline solution, and ice packs can be placed in groin and axilla where large vessels come close to skin surface. Sorry for the delay. Hyperkalemia results when cell membranes are disrupted and when acidosis is severe. So glucose and insulin, 10 units of regular insulin in 50 ml of 50% glucose titrated to the effect can be administered to lower serum potassium temporarily. Beta agonist can also be also move potassium intracellularly. Intravenous fluid should be given to maintain normal cardiac filling pressure as evidenced by adequate perfusion pressure, urine output, and capillary refill. So these are the drugs that are used to treat an acute episode of malignant hyperthermia. Dantrolene, the 2.5 to 10 milligram per kg or more. There should be adequate sterile water to dilute dantrolene. Sodium bicarbonate 2 millimole per kg as needed. Iced normal saline solution. Mannitol and furosemide. Mannitol at a dose of 300 milligram per kg and furosemide at a dose of 0.5 to 1 milligram per kg. Insulin regular to treat any hyperkalemia, and lidocaine 1 milligram per kg. So this is the available form of dantrolene in our state, Dandrium. So each vial contains 20 milligram of dantrolene sodium and 3000 milligram of mannitol and sufficient sodium hydroxide to yield a pH of approximately 9.5% when reconstituted. The other form of dantrolene available is Rhinodex. The one which we use is Dandrium. So it contains 20 milligram of dantrolene, 3000 milligram of mannitol. The pH after reconstitution is 9.5. The sterile water needed to dilute this vial is 60 ml, and the shelf life of this vial is 36 months. That is, after reconstitution, we can use that vial only for 36 months. So the cost of this 20 milligram of dantrolene available in our state is approximately $69. So what is the mechanism of action of dantrolene? Dantrolene inhibits the release of calcium from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, limited the activation of calcium-dependent ryanodine receptor 1, and it blocks ECCE. I have mentioned about two mechanisms by which calcium enter the sarcoplasm. One is ECCA and SOCE. This dantrolene particularly blocks this excitation-coupled calcium release across the plasma membrane. Dantrolene can also produce clinically significant weakness and decrease metabolism in normal muscle as well as in malignant hyperthermia susceptible muscle. Dantrolene can reduce elevated creatinine kinase in patients with diseased muscle independent of the presence of ryanodine receptor mutation. The half-life of dantrolene in children is somewhat shorter than in adults. That is, in children, it will be 7.3 to 9.8 hours, and in adults, it will be 12.1 hours. The initial dantrolene dose should be 2.5 milligram per kg, although more than 10 milligram per kg may be needed to control this episode. So what are the post-anesthesia consideration when you treat when you have treated the malignant hyperthermia patient in no operation theater? They will be requiring intensive care to continue treatment and monitor for late manifestation of disorder. Continuation of dantrolene is necessary because recrudescence of malignant hyperthermia can occur after an episode that has apparently been successfully treated. Patients with muscular body type who experienced temperature increase and who had longer interval between induction of anesthesia and beginning of malignant hyperthermia reaction had a risk of recrudescence. So as much as 12 milligram per kg of dantrolene has been required to treat recurrence over 12 hours post-operatively. Continuous monitoring of vital signs, minute ventilation, frequent measurement of venous lactate, blood gases should detect metabolic changes. Late manifestation of episode of malignant hyperthermia range from mild muscle pain to multi-organ system failure, and cerebral edema can occur. Permanent cases of malignant hyperthermia may be followed by permanent neurological sequelae also. Pulmonary edema may occur because of marked shift in intravascular volume, myocardial dysfunction, and the effect of heat shock. The presence of pulmonary edema requires more careful assessment of the circulatory status to improve cardiac filling pressure and inotropic state. Areas of myocardium may have abnormal conduction, decreased contractility, or both. It is important to maintain adequate renal perfusion because massive myoglobinuria produced by fulminant malignant hyperthermia that can cause acute renal failure also. So what are the drugs likely to trigger malignant hyperthermia? As we all know, inhalational agents like sevoflurane, desflurane, isoflurane, especially halothane, enflurane, ether, and depolarizing neuromuscular blocker like succinylcholine. Drugs which do not trigger malignant hyperthermia are narcotics, dexmedetomidine, benzodiazepines, barbiturates, propofol, ketamine, non-depolarizing neuromuscular blockers, anticholinesterase and anticholinergics, local anesthetic, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, and also extracellularly, calcium also will not trigger malignant hyperthermia. So what will we do when we have a patient who we suspect to have malignant hyperthermia? There is a diagnostic test which we can do in a patient who are suspected that they can have malignant hyperthermia. Suppose if the patient is telling there is a unexplained death in family due to anesthesia, there is high incidence of high temperature rise. If the patient is saying some history like that, we can do a diagnostic test to find out whether the patient is having malignant hyperthermia. That test is called as CHCT, that is caffeine halothane contracture test. This is a gold standard test, diagnostic test for malignant hyperthermia susceptibility. It requires skeletal muscle biopsy from patient's thigh to assess muscle contractile properties upon exposure to ryanodine receptor agonist. Example, caffeine and halothane are used. It must be performed at the malignant hyperthermia muscle biopsy center. Abnormally high level of contractile force indicates the patient is susceptible to malignant hyperthermia. The sensitivity of the test is close to 100% and specificity is approximately 80%. So what will we do if we have a patient who is having malignant hyperthermia or suspected to have malignant hyperthermia? The first and foremost thing we have to do is we have to document. We have to document that the patient is susceptible to have malignant hyperthermia, and we have to explain the attenders regarding this condition and the risks that are involved in this condition. So regional or local anesthesia should be planned accordingly. Prophylactic dantrolene is not indicated in patients who are suspected to have malignant hyperthermia. If an anesthesia workstation is going to be used, it must be cleaned of residual inhalational anesthetic. So what are the intra-op things we will do? We should avoid all the triggering agents. We should modify anesthesia techniques with total intravenous anesthesia or regional anesthesia. Temperature monitoring should be done. We should watch for malignant hyperthermia syndrome symptoms, and we should keep dantrolene ready. So these are the guidelines given by MHAUS, Malignant Hyperthermia of United States treatment guidelines for if we have a patient with malignant hyperthermia. We should stop inhalation anesthetic immediately. We should cancel or conclude the surgery as soon as possible. Place charcoal filters on the inspiratory or expiratory rim of new gas delivery hoses. We should hyperventilate patient with over 10 liters per minute of 100% of oxygen. Dantrolene should be administered 2.5 milligram per kg intravenously and repeat dose if needed. We should initiate cooling with intravenous cold saline solution and correct metabolic acidosis with 1 to 2 milliequivalents per kg of sodium bicarbonate. Administrate calcium 10 milligram per kg of calcium chloride or insulin in 50% dextrose in water. And we should follow ACLS algorithm to treat any dysrhythmias. Lidocaine may be given during a malignant hyperthermia crisis. We should maintain urine output of 2 ml per kg per hour with additional mannitol or furosemide if required. We can insert an arterial and central venous catheter, and we should repeat venous blood gas and electrolyte analysis every 15 minutes until these vital signs become normalized. So summary, malignant hyperthermia is a potentially lethal pharmacogenetic syndrome. It has been particular concern to pediatric anesthesiologists because succinylcholine and inhalational anesthetics are potent triggers of malignant hyperthermia and may administered often in practice of pediatric anesthesia. With advanced improved monitoring techniques and availability of intravenous dantrolene, mortality from malignant hyperthermia has plummeted. It falls to anesthesiologists to choose drugs that maximize the safety of patient to identify as potentially malignant hyperthermia syndrome those individuals who experience adverse reaction consistent with malignant hyperthermia, and to counsel and refer those individuals and families to appropriate diagnostic centers. Anesthesiologists must also make fellow physicians and other healthcare workers aware of this existence and the seriousness of malignant hyperthermia, its effective treatment and prevention. When capnography and blood gas analysis, core temperature monitoring, and dandruff are available, malignant hyperthermia syndrome patients may safely receive routine anesthetic care without potent inhalation anesthetic or succinylcholine. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Reshma, for an excellent presentation about malignant hyperexia.
Thank you, sir.
30 years of pediatric anesthesia experience. I have seen only one straightforward case of malignant hyperexia and a few suspected cases. Due to some reasons, this malignant hyperexia is not that common in our part or in our country. But the literature, it is rampant in Europe and US. So every pediatric center there, they keep this dandruff. Here the cost is too high. The vial that we have in a hospital, we have purchased, and it is being sold roughly around 6,000 to 7,000 rupees per vial. And each pediatric patient may require 2 or 3. And it may require even up to 10 to 12. What the literature says is you are supposed to keep it whenever you do any case of malignant hyperexia. One small thing that I want to tell you is, you said after dilution it can be kept for 36 weeks, 36 months.
36 months, yes, sir.
Only the dry powder can be kept for 36 months. That too, not even 36 months. The thing that is being supplied to us, its shelf life is only 2 years. That is the problem of getting. So if I buy 10 vials, that is going to cost 70,000 rupees. If I use it, I'll have to answer in the audit. So that is the main thing. But still, this drug is a wonder drug. If you have a patient with malignant hyperexia, you cannot save the child unless you give this dandruff.
Yes,
Thank you, Dr. Reshma. Now we have the next speaker. Reshma, you can take and share your slides.
Yes, sir.
And the next topic is another important anesthetic topic. Every day we do lots of laparoscopes. Whenever we do a laparoscope, commonly used gases, carbon dioxide. And now we have Dr. Anandi, who is going to speak on hypercarbia.
Shall I share this?
Yeah, you can start sharing. So when we put a needle inside and when they start pushing carbon dioxide, one of the most important monitor that anesthesiologist should be saying is the three lights that you burning in the insufflator. Okay, so one will show the pressure, one will show the flow, and another will show the total flow. I have been watching postgraduate; they are not concentrating on that part. That is a very important monitor that you should see. So let us hear from Dr. Anandi from ESI about the hypercarbia and laparoscopy. Dr. Anandi, you can start.
Laparoscopic surgery.
Dr. Anandi, you introduce yourself, then you can start. You got to share your slides. Yes, you are able to see now. You can start, introduce yourself, then you can start. Dr. Anandi, we can't hear you.
Dr. Anandi, kindly unmute yourself.
Hello, sir. Can you
That's fine.
hear me, sir?
Yeah, we
Hello,
can
sir.
hear you. Go to your first slide. We can hear you.
Okay.
And we can see the thing. Yes.
My name is Dr. Anandi from ESIC Medical College. I am doing second year. My topic is hypercarbia and laparoscopic surgery. For any laparoscopic surgery, the first step is creation of pneumoperitoneum. Pneumoperitoneum is usually done by insufflation of gas into the peritoneal cavity. Intraperitoneal insufflation is usually done using a needle called Veress needle. It is connected to a self-automated, self-regulated insufflator. The rate of insufflation is 4 to 6 liters per minute. The intra-abdominal pressure rises to 12 to 15 mm of mercury. Usually, the gases used are nitrous oxide, air, xenon, helium, but the most ideal gas to be used is carbon dioxide. Why carbon dioxide is the most ideal gas is because it has a high diffusion coefficient, high and highly soluble in blood. That makes it comfortable for pulmonary removal. It is non-inflammable and safe to use for cautery. It's non-oxidizing and inert and does not react with tissue. Carbon dioxide is absorbed from the peritoneal cavity and carried via the blood to the systemic and portal circulation and is eliminated by the lungs. Post desufflation, carbon dioxide can remain in the body for 24 hours. The physiological changes during pneumoperitoneum is usually because of the positioning of the patient, the increase in intra-abdominal pressure, and hypercarbia. The lungs, hypercarbia produces increased pulmonary arterial pressure, pulmonary venous pressure, causes vasoconstriction, subcutaneous emphysema, gas embolism. In heart, it causes arrhythmias, myocardial depression, myocardial ischemia, impaired hemoglobin affinity, causes decreased intestinal and hepatic perfusion, increased renal proton excretion, and decreased systemic vascular resistance. The respiratory system, the increase in PaCO2 causes hypercarbia, which causes respiratory acidosis. Increase in left ventricular afterload causes pulmonary hypertension. All of this culminantly leads to VQ mismatch, and this is compensated by hyperventilation. In cardiovascular system, it has direct and indirect effect. The adrenergic pathway. Mild hypercarbia usually is hemodynamically compensated. Severe hypercarbia at 55 to 70 mmHg causes myocardial depression, dysarrhythmias from catecholamine-induced sensitization, increased RV afterload causing pulmonary edema, and increased systemic vascular resistance. Positioning also increases the tendency to hypoxia and hypercarbia because in Trendelenburg position, there's upward displacement of diaphragm, there is reduction in functional residual capacity, reduction in pulmonary compliance, and increase in peak and plateau pressure. All of this causes atelectasis and VQ mismatch, which also leads to hypercarbia and hypoxia. These are the changes that happens in Trendelenburg and reverse Trendelenburg. In Trendelenburg, the pulmonary artery pressure raises and pulmonary capillary wedge pressure raises, cardiac output increases, systemic vascular resistance increases, pulmonary compliance decreases, and pulmonary artery pressure increases. In reverse Trendelenburg, the arterial pressure decreases, pulmonary capillary wedge pressure decreases, cardiac output decreases, systemic vascular resistance increases, pulmonary compliance increases, and pulmonary artery pressure decreases. Trendelenburg and reverse Trendelenburg, the physiology is slightly opposite to each other. What are the causes for severe hypercarbia during a laparoscopic surgery? The causes are two causes. Either it's excessive absorption of carbon dioxide or inadequate removal of carbon dioxide. With excessive absorption, it could be because of venous embolism, subcutaneous emphysema, capnothorax, capnopericardium, inadequate removal, hypoventilation, endobronchial intubation, atelectasis, cardiogenic shock, and exhaustion of carbon dioxide absorber. What is the relationship between ATCO2 and PaCO2? During insufflation, initially there is an increase in carbon dioxide and it plateaus at 10 to 15 minutes. An increase in intra-abdominal pressure of 15 mmHg increases the PaCO2 by 10 mmHg. This helps to detection of intravascular insufflation and it can also helps in maintain the PaCO2 level during the procedure. A sudden increase in EtCO2 is because of subcutaneous emphysema. A sudden decrease in EtCO2 is because of uh, venous embolism. Because of venous embolism, the EtCO2 cannot be detected, so there will be a sudden fall in the EtCO2. What ventilation strategies can be used to prevent hypercarbia? The aim of our ventilation is to eliminate carbon dioxide, that is to avoid hypercarbia, thereby avoiding. We have to increase the pressure 10 seconds, which will release the atelic tissues. Coming to venous embolism, a direct insertion of needle into a blood vessel or a solid organ will cause carbon dioxide embolism. The gas will move into the cyanosis or in saturation acidosis. The causes for these are prolonged surgery, increased intra-abdominal pressure more than 15 mmHg, EtCO2 more than 50 mmHg, and high flow rates. Transthoracic esophageal echocardiogram is the most sensitive way to detect. You see, there will be air bubbles in the right heart chamber. The treatment for this is immediate termination of the procedure and abdominal decompression, a removal of carbon dioxide by hyperventilation and 100% O2. We have Trendelenburg or lateral decubitus position will minimize the airlock. Cardiopulmonary resuscitation will be required if the patient is in asystole. Insertion of central venous catheter to aspirate the gas and hyperbaric chamber. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Anandi, for a nice presentation. Just want to know, you said carbon dioxide embolism. Okay, yeah, that is an accepted problem. But how many ml should be there to produce this carbon dioxide embolism to produce pulmonary effect? Is there any quantified amount?
The 20 ml.
For all ages, it is 20 ml. Could you just refer in the next class?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And one more advantage that we aim with carbon dioxide is because it's highly soluble. Even if it goes to the periphery, it gets dissolved. So that is an advantage of using the carbon dioxide. Thank you, Dr. Anandi. I think you can remove stop your sharing. Now we'll go to the next speaker. I think Dr. Nirupa Koshi.
Yes, sir. Good afternoon, sir. Am I audible?
Good afternoon. Yeah, you are audible. You can screen your.
Yes, sir.
And she is going to talk about how to diagnose intraoperative bronchospasm and management. And she will not be going into depth. She'll just give you an overall view. Because of the paucity of time, we thought we'll take few cases which may produce respiratory acidosis, more so in acute respiratory acidosis, and how to manage them. So this is not a class about any ventilatory strategy for a particular disease. It is an overall class about respiratory acidosis. So she will just give you a guidelines.
Sir, I'm not able to share my.
You are not able to share your screen?
Sir, I'm not able to share my slide.
Okay, just hold on.
Yes, sir.
Anandi, have you removed your screen? Anandi, has she removed? Dr. Nirupa, I have your slides. I'll share it.
Okay, sir.
Just
okay, sir.
Are you able to see, doctor?
Yes, sir.
Okay, you can introduce yourself and you can start your presentation.
Okay, sir. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dr. Nirupa. I'm from Madras Medical College. Today, I'll be talking about intraoperative bronchospasm, the diagnosis and management. Next slide. Next slide, sir. Based on the risk factors, intraoperative bronchospasm can be associated with an IgE-mediated anaphylaxis. In these cases, you would see cutaneous manifestations in the form of erythema, and even prolonged episodes of desaturation are seen when it's associated with an anaphylaxis. Shock and cardiovascular compromise can also be seen. In non-allergic causes, it's usually due to mechanical factors like airway manipulation and intubation, drugs like beta blockers, NSAIDs, acetylcholinesterase inhibitors, and surgical stimulation like traction of peritoneum, anal and cervical dilatation, stripping of the saphenous vein in the presence of inadequate depth of anesthesia can also lead to bronchospasm. Next slide. The signs and symptoms include whenever bronchospasm occurs, on auscultating the chest, you will see that there's a prolonged expiration along with an expiratory wheeze. In severe cases, when the air entry is restricted, it can even lead to a silent chest. In cases where we are we are manually ventilating, you can feel a tight bag or a decreased pulmonary compliance. Increased peak airway pressures are seen during intermittent positive pressure ventilation. End-tidal carbon dioxide shows an increase, and a capnography shows a characteristic shark fin appearance. Prolonged episodes of bronchospasm can lead to a drop in oxygen saturation. Because of air trapping due to the constriction of the bronchial smooth muscles, there is an auto PEEP or an intrinsic PEEP which is developed. This will increase the intrathoracic pressure, reduce the venous return, and can lead to hypotension. Rash is usually associated if anaphylaxis causes bronchospasm. This is the characteristic capnographic change that we see. You will see a shark fin appearance because the narrowed airways and prolonged expiration results in a delayed rise in the end-tidal carbon dioxide, producing a characteristic shark fin appearance. Next. Preventing, since mostly bronchospasm is seen in patients with hyperreactive airway. In patients with hyperreactive airway coming for an elective surgery, we can ask them to do chest physiotherapy, use of sufficient bronchodilators and steroids. And since a viral upper respiratory tract infection is a trigger to bronchospasm, a good infection control is necessary to prevent perioperative bronchospasm. Cessation of smoking. Pre-treatment of these patients with inhaled nebulized beta agonists can be done prior to surgery. A non-specific beta blocker should be avoided. You can use lidocaine to suppress the intubation stress response. Induction in these patients should be preferred with propofol or ketamine. Ketamine preferably because it's a more potent bronchodilator, and adequate depth of anesthesia should be achieved before airway manipulation and intubation. Avoid thiopentone, atracurium, morphine, and mivacurium because these lead to histamine release and can trigger bronchospasm. Desflurane and isoflurane also, when introduced quickly, can trigger bronchospasm. During reversal, use of acetylcholinesterase inhibitors like neostigmine and physostigmine should be used along with adequate doses of anticholinergic agents. In case Sugammadex is available, that would be a better choice because it does not have any muscarinic side effects. Next. If in case bronchospasm develops, our immediate management would be to switch to 100% oxygen, manually ventilate, and deepen the plane of anesthesia. Sevoflurane can be increased, or propofol ketamine boluses can be given to deepen the plane of anesthesia. And if in case this bronchospasm developed after blood products colloid, please consider allergy anaphylaxis and treat accordingly. Next. Drug therapy. Salbutamol can be given through a meter dose inhaler using an inline adapter or directly into the ET tube. 6 to 8 puffs would be required. Nebulization with 1 ml of 0.5% salbutamol or 250 microgram can be given slow IV. Ipratropium bromide can be given 0.5 milligram nebulized. Magnesium sulfate 50 milligram per kg IV can be given over 20 minutes. Hydrocot up to 200 mg IV can be given. Methylprednisolone can be given 1 milligram per kg. However, the action is slow for onset. Ketamine boluses of 10 to 20 milligram can be given IV, and in refractory cases, adrenaline can be given 10 microgram to 100 microgram. So in a patient with hyperreactive airway, as in bronchial asthma, COPD, coming for elective cases, a good pre-treatment with salbutamol oral bronchodilators can be given. Induction in these patients should be done with propofol or ketamine. Thiopentone should be avoided. Atracurium is avoided. Vecuronium or rocuronium is preferred. Hydrocort can be given preemptively itself. And reversal should be ideally with sufficient doses of anticholinergic agent. And if Sugammadex is available, that would be preferred. Thank you, sir. So you're not audible, sir.
This is one case that we'll be keeping in the clinical examination. If we don't get a case, we'll make somebody pretend to have bronchial asthma. Then we'll ask you and we'll give you a history of acute attack of bronchial asthma, or a patient with the history of bronchial asthma coming for an anesthetic procedure, which has to be done under GA. So we expect you to just tell us how do you diagnose, how do you prevent, and how do you treat an intraoperative bronchospasm. This is what we expect in the exam. So that is the reason why I have selected this particular topic. And Dr. Nirosh has done a good job. Thank you, doctor.
Thank you, sir.
Our next speaker is going to talk on the same problem if it is going to be a chronic patient, a COPD patient who comes to our ICU, drowsy. Okay, when the patient is drowsy, naturally we'll have to take over. This chance of NAV, use of NAV becomes less. So we may have to intubate these patients. So the next speaker is going to tell you how to ventilate, or what are the major settings in ventilation. She's not going to explain in detail because of time factor. So a COPD patient coming for ICU ventilation, what are the major implications or the problem that you should expect and how to go about the problem. So now I request, are you able to share, doctor? I'll remove my sharing.
Yes, sir.
Srinidhi?
Yes, sir, I'll share.
Okay. You can start, you can introduce yourself.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Dr. Srinidhi, second year postgraduate from MC.
Srinidhi, we are not able to see your screen. We are not able to see your screen, doctor. Please share your screen.
Is it visible now, sir?
No, it is not visible, doctor. No, it is not visible.
1 second, sir. Sir, now is it visible, sir?
Just see. Yeah, it is visible now.
Yes, sir.
It is visible to others also.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Okay, Dr. Srinidhi, you can start.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Dr. Srinidhi, second year postgraduate from MC. Today, I'll be talking about ventilation strategies in a chronic obstructive pulmonary disease patient. So a brief introduction of what is COPD. So it is a common preventable and treatable disease that is characterized by persistent respiratory symptoms and airflow limitation. So airflow limitation is a very important feature that should be there to diagnose a patient as having COPD. So that is due to airway or alveolar abnormalities, usually due to significant exposure to noxious particles or gases and influenced by host factors, including abnormal lung development. So the risk factors, as we all are aware, tobacco, smoke, pollution, occupational exposures, aging, airway hyperreactivity, and recurrent respiratory infections, and sometimes genetics plays a very important role. Next is the diagnosis needs the following symptoms like dyspnea, chronic cough or chronic sputum production, and history of risk factors, etc. So I'll go on to the classification of airflow limitation severity. So post bronchodilator forced expiratory volume in the first second is measured here. So FEV1 by FVC, that is out of the forced vital capacity, the forced expiratory volume in the first second, if it's less than 0.7, only then we can classify it as COPD. Then after that, FEV1 percentage, that is how much FEV1 has reduced. So if it is more than or equal to 80% of the predicted value for that person, it is mild. If it is 50 to 80% of the predicted value, it is moderate. And if it is 30% to 50% of the predicted value, it is severe COPD. And it is very severe if the FEV1 is less than 30% predicted. So next is exacerbation of COPD. So exacerbation is acute worsening of the symptoms that can lead to additional therapy. This can again be mild, moderate, or severe. So very rapid, I'll go through this very rapidly. So what is the pathophysiology is, as the disease progresses, signs of hyperinflation will occur. So there is airflow obstruction. So there is incomplete emptying of the lungs, so resulting in hyperinflation. So that can manifest as barrel chest and poor diaphragmatic excursion, and the patient can present with expiratory wheezing because of obstruction of the airway, and signs of respiratory distress like tachypnea, use of accessory muscles of respiration, and cyanosis is present. Radiographic features include hyperinflated lung fields with flattened diaphragm and vertical cardiac cell out, etc. CT chest shows bronchial wall thickening, alveolar septal destruction, and air space enlargement. So pulmonary function test, which is important for the diagnosis, that will show all these values as mentioned earlier. And ABG will show a relatively normal values of arterial blood gases until this disease becomes severe. Where PaO2 will usually decrease only when the first FEV1 is less than 50% predicted. PaCO2 may not increase until FEV1 is even lower. So the treatment strategies for COPD is pharmacological therapy, where we give patients bronchodilators, antimuscarinic drugs, etc., anti-inflammatory agents, antibiotics, and mucoregulators. Again, we have to advise the patient for smoking cessation and vaccination against several respiratory infections. Supportive and palliative care for end-stage diseases can be given. Oxygen therapy for patients who are not able to maintain an adequate level of oxygenation, and ventilatory support for exacerbations or very severe forms of the disease. Surgical interventions like lung volume reduction surgery, bullectomy, transplantation are also available. So here we will focus on the ventilatory support. So non-invasive ventilation, very few slides on non-invasive ventilation. So this is a major form of intervention on our part. So for patients with acute respiratory failure who can't maintain adequate level of oxygenation and who can't ventilate well, we'll start them on non-invasive ventilation. So there are three modes of NIV ventilation. So before this, we should select the patient for NIV. So who are those candidates for non-invasive ventilation? Is patients with respiratory distress with severe hypoxemia or hypercapnia, when the acute respiratory failure is not an immediate threat to life, or no life-threatening circulatory disorder is present, or when the patient is awake and cooperative and airway protective reflexes should be intact, and there should be no recurrent vomiting and no facial anomaly. So the three modes of ventilation are the CPAP, BiPAP, and the pressure support ventilation. So CPAP is spontaneous breathing at a positive end expiratory pressure. So this needs a source of oxygen, a face mask with an expiratory valve that maintains a positive end expiratory pressure. So the principal effect is to increase the FRC. So this does not augment the tidal volume. So limited use in our setup. Next is BiPAP. High-level positive airway pressure is CPAP that alternates between two pressure levels. That is, the higher pressure level is inspiratory positive airway pressure, and low pressure level is expiratory positive airway pressure. So these are added to get the peak airway pressure. Most of the time is spent at low pressure level, that is EPAP. So BiPAP achieves higher mean airway pressure than CPAP, promotes alveolar recruitment, increases lung compliance, and indirectly enhances the tidal volume. So in obesity, hypoventilation syndrome with acute respiratory failure, either BiPAP or CPAP can be used. Next is pressure support ventilation. Pressure augmented spontaneous breathing allows patient to control inspiratory time and tidal volume. So low levels of pressure support ventilation will reduce the work of breathing without augmenting the tidal volume. So this can be used when the patient is going to be weaned from mechanical ventilation. Higher pressure levels can augment the tidal volume. So CPAP with pressure support is the preferred mode in acute exacerbation of COPD. So non-invasive ventilation should be instituted early before progression of the condition to life-threatening carbon dioxide retention. Next, this is the difference between CPAP and BiPAP. CPAP is continuous airway pressure that is maintained during spontaneous breathing. Whereas BiPAP, there is a higher pressure level called IPAP and a lower pressure level called EPAP. Okay, next. So those patients who are not suitable for non-invasive ventilation should be started on positive pressure ventilation, or those patients where non-invasive ventilation does not bring about a change in their oxygenation or carbon dioxide elimination levels, they can be started on positive pressure ventilation. So the following are the problems that are, so we prefer the volume control mode of mechanical ventilation because it is more dynamic and we can change several parameters there. So what are the problems that we encounter in a COPD patient is a dynamic hyperinflation. So what is dynamic hyperinflation is during normal breathing, there is complete exhalation of the gas that we inhale. So leaving behind only the functional residual capacity. But because of airflow obstruction, that is seen in COPD, exhalation is prolonged and some amount of gas is trapped in the alveoli. Exhalation is not complete because of the obstruction. So gas trapping can result in positive end expiratory pressure that is intrinsic, or that is occurred sometimes because we are not able to see that in a regular ventilator setup in sometimes, but we can also see that, which I'll talk about later. So intrinsic PEEP or auto PEEP is that air which is trapped because of the expiratory airflow obstruction. So so this is dynamic hyperinflation. So here there is normally the flow at the end of expiration should reach the zero level. But when there is gas trapping, even at the end of exhalation, there is gas flow. And there is increased pressure that is seen at the end of exhalation, which is called as the auto positive end expiratory pressure. So what happens is when there is added pressure in the alveoli, so the breathing will occur in a flatter portion of the pressure volume loop, and so the respiratory muscles must generate a higher transpulmonary pressure to draw normal lung volume. So this can result in increased work of breathing. One second. Yeah, this picture shows what I was telling about. So when there is an airway collapse and the air is trapped inside the lung, there is plus 10 centimeter water of auto PEEP generated, whereas outside the airway it is zero. So in order to draw air inside the lungs, the patient should generate extra negative inspiratory pressure to draw air inside the lungs because of the gradient. So actually air can move from higher pressure to lower pressure, but inside the lungs there is a positive pressure. So to overcome this, patient has to put in more effort. So that is increased work of breathing. So this auto PEEP has got adverse consequences like it can distend the alveoli and can result in ventilator-induced lung injury like barotrauma, voluotrauma and all. Increased intrathoracic pressure can have its hemodynamic consequences. So there are several methods to measure auto PEEP. So we can monitor the flow waveforms from the ventilator waveforms itself. We can diagnose auto PEEP. So the presence of expiratory flow at the end of expiration like this is evidence of auto PEEP. Quantification of auto PEEP is by occluding the expiratory circuit at the end of expiration. The alveolar pressure after the occlusion of the circuit will equilibrate with proximal airway pressure, and auto PEEP becomes apparent as an abrupt increase in airway pressure. So the left side figure shows flow and airway pressure waveforms from a patient with COPD receiving mechanical ventilation. So at the end of expiration, if you are going to stop the circuit, you can measure, you can see that the pressure doesn't reach the flat line, it is still high. So that is the auto PEEP level. That is the intrinsic positive end expiratory pressure. If you are not holding the patient's respiratory cycle in expiration, the waveforms are otherwise normal. So only when you are holding the cycle in expiration, you can see auto PEEP. So this is why it is called as occult PEEP. And so there are two different types of auto PEEP, that is static and dynamic auto PEEP. So the dynamic auto PEEP is what we see in waveforms before occluding the circuit. We can see a minute levels of increase in the end expiratory pressure that shows only the alveoli that are emptying first. But after holding the respiratory cycle in expiration phase, it will all the alveoli will equilibrate, and that will produce that will actually show the correct value of auto PEEP that is present in the patient. So this auto PEEP level provides measure of how severe the obstruction of airway is. So this is again after end expiratory occlusion. We can see that the end expiratory pressure doesn't reach the flat line. It is still higher up. So showing that there is a positive end expiratory pressure. So this is the effect of auto PEEP on the work of breathing. That is, it increases the work of breathing and patients can develop respiratory muscle fatigue. Okay, so other hemodynamic effects of auto PEEP include it decreases the venous return and preload, and cardiac output can result in cardiovascular collapse. There can be some electromechanical dissociation in patients with severe COPD. Once starting the positive pressure ventilation, there will be a sinus rhythm, but the patient will go for a sudden cardiovascular collapse. That is because of auto PEEP. So decreases left ventricular compliance because of raised intrathoracic pressure, and increases the right ventricular afterload, that is by increasing the pulmonary capillary wedge pressure. So again, patient ventilator asynchrony can occur because of some increased work of breathing. So how to avoid auto PEEP? So what are our strategies to overcome auto PEEP? So first is minute ventilation is going to be the main determinant of hyperinflation. So our goal of ventilatory pattern should be maintain as minimal as possible the minute ventilation by maintaining a tidal volume of 6 to 8 ml per kg. And the respiratory rate should be around 8 to 12 per minute. And we have to give time for exhalation so that all the gas that is trapped can get exhaled. So long exhalation time and high inspiratory flow. So let me discuss in detail about this point. So how to increase the duration of exhalation? So when there are two settings. So when the respiratory rate is constant, so that time the inspiratory flow rate is tidal volume by inspiratory time. So based on this formula, we can adjust the inspiratory time. So the time for exhalation can be prolonged by decreasing the time for inhalation. So in some ventilators, there is the separate setting for decreasing inspiratory time. So in such ventilators, the inspiratory time can be adjusted. We can decrease it directly, and that can directly prolong duration of exhalation. But in some, we can't directly alter the inspiratory time. So in those ventilators, indirectly we can decrease inspiratory time by decreasing the tidal volume or by increasing the inspiratory flow rate. So from this formula, we can see that inspiratory time is directly proportional to the tidal volume and indirectly proportional to the inspiratory flow rate. So inspiratory time can be decreased by decreasing tidal volume or increasing inspiratory flow rate. Otherwise, in the other setting where the respiratory rate can be altered, so we can reduce the respiratory rate, thereby prolonging the time taken for exhalation. So this is how this is an important ventilator strategy to avoid or to decrease auto PEEP. Next is in all the patients having airflow obstruction, The pressure that is necessary to trigger the ventilator should be kept minimal, because already their airflow is obstructed. They won't be able to generate enough pressure that can be sensed by the ventilator to deliver the breath. So the pressure trigger for the ventilator to deliver a breath should be kept minimal. Then we have to be aware of the components that can increase the work of breathing. So inappropriate ET tube size, secretion, heat, moisture exchange. Sir, am I audible, sir?
You are audible, doctor. Proceed.
Hello.
You are audible. You
Yes,
are
sir. Yes, sir. So expiratory time can be prolonged by reducing the respiratory rate. Okay, so we have to be aware of the components that increase the work of breathing, as I was telling earlier. Inappropriately sized ET tube, secretions or kinking of the circuit, or elbow-shaped parts in the circuit, or any heat moisture exchange in the circuit. All these things will add to the work of breathing of the patient. So again, we can adopt lung protective ventilation strategies that will be discussed in detail by the next presenter. So these are some new strategies that can be adopted apart from our ventilation strategies, like high intensity non-invasive ventilation, where high IPAP levels, these are settings within non-invasive ventilation. So these have proven to show some improvement in the health condition and the quality of life of patients of COPD. And next is high frequency chest wall oscillation and intrapulmonary percussive ventilation. They aid the clearance of secretions in a patient with COPD. And neurally adjusted ventilator assist, that is NAVA NIV. So this is a mode of non-invasive ventilation where electrodes will be placed in the diaphragm, and depending on the patient's effort or patient's trigger, the ventilator will deliver its breath, so that we can decrease the asynchrony between the ventilator and the patient. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Srinidhi, for an excellent presentation on a difficult topic. So now we'll go to the last speaker, who is going to talk about a patient with ARDS coming for ventilation and what is a ventilatory management alone. As I said, due to the pass of time, we are just going to concentrate only on a few parts. So Dr. Vigneswaran will start presenting about ventilatory management of ARDS patient. Dr. Vigneswaran.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, you can start your presentation. Introduce yourself and start, Dr. Vigneswaran.
Yes, sir. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Vigneswaran, second year postgraduate from Madras Medical College. We are going to see about
Dr. Vignesh. Dr. Vignesh,
sir.
go slowly. Just go.
Yes, sir. Okay, sir. Hello, sir.
Proceed.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Dr. Vigneswaran, second year postgraduate from Madras Medical College. We are going to see about ARDS, acute respiratory distress syndrome, especially ventilatory management. Here we can see the chest X-ray and CT chest of the ARDS patient. To diagnose ARDS, Bolin-Figueira is user. Bolin-Figueira was proposed in 2012. It constitutes 4 parameters. Those four parameters are timing, chest imaging, edema origin, and oxygenation. First, timing. To say ARDS, the time should be less than 1 week. On chest imaging, there should be bilateral opacities, pleural effusions, lung collapse, and nodules should be excluded. And origin of the edema. Usually, ARDS is to say ARDS, the cardiac cause should be ruled out. That is, absence of cardiac failure and fluid overload should be ruled out. Next, oxygenation. In oxygenation, we can classify into 3 categories: mild, moderate, and severe. In mild part, PaO2 by FiO2, that is Caritas index, less than or equal to 300 millimeter mercury with peak 5 centimeter H2O. In moderate ARDS, Caricos index between 100 to 200 millimeter mercury will be greater than or equal to 5 centimeters H2O. In severe ARDS, Caricos index less than or equal to 100 millimeter mercury with peak greater than or equal to 5 centimeters H2O. Then what are the causes of ARDS? ARDS may be caused due to direct lung injury or pneumonia, aspiration of the gastric content, emboli, toxic inhalation, lung contusion, drowning, reperfusion injury after lung transplantation. The indirect cause, ARDS may be due to sepsis, septic shock, acute pancreatitis, multiple trauma, transfusion, drug toxicity, and CPB, cardiopulmonary bypass. Then pathophysiology of ARDS. In ARDS, any one of the above said insult may cause activation of the neutrophil, which in turn causes the neutrophil recruitments at the basement membrane of pulmonary capillaries. Hence, these neutrophils will enter from the pulmonary capillaries into the lung. That is lung cells or lung parenchyma or interstitial tissue by a process called diaphoresis. There, after crossing the capillary basement membrane, proteolytic degradation of the granules occurs, and which in turn activates other white blood cells. And also that along with the leukocytes or neutrophils, some other leukocytes, platelets, and the fibrin deposition may occur in the lung interstitial tissues. Thus, in the first slide, we are appreciating normal lung, while in the second slide, there is enormous infiltration of the neutrophils, leukocytes, and fibrin deposits. This is a classical histopathological slide of ARDS patient. Then lung protection strategies. In ARDS patient, the main goal is to avoid barotrauma or volute trauma and to prevent atelectasis. Hence, we are adapting this type of ventilation, that is lung protective ventilation. So these strategies are adapted from ARDS net protocol. ARDS net protocol. First, we may choose any other mode, volume or pressure control mode, but volume control mode is preferred one. Then first we have to set tidal volume of about 4 to 8 ml per kg predicted body weight. Then P greater than or equal to 5 centimeter H2O. To start with, we can set 5 centimeter H2O. And inspiratory-expiratory ratio. Either we can start with 1:1 or 1:3. The main goal is we should that expiratory time should be greater than the inspiratory time to avoid CO2 accumulation or autocave. Then respiratory rate. We should set initial respiratory rate less than 35, and next goal is outlet pH. Outlet pH may be maintained between 7.30 to 7.45. These are adapted from ARDS net protocol. Then what is that protocol? This protocol consists of 2 parts. First part consists of ventilator setup and adjustment. Second part consists of weaning an ARDS patient. In the first part, as usual, we have to select volume control mode, and because we have to set up a tidal volume 4 to 8 ml per kg. To start with, we can set up 8 ml per kg of predicted body weight. What is predicted body weight? Predicted body weight may be calculated by this formula. In male patient, 50 plus 2.3 cross 18 inches minus 60 centimeter, while in female patient, 45.5 plus 2.3 18 inches minus 60. By this formula, we can calculate the predicted body weight and set up the tidal volume according to that. And we should, after setting the tidal volume, we should set up P, and we should look for the plateau pressure. The plateau pressure should be less than or equal to 30 centimeter water. Plateau pressure should be less than or equal to 30 centimeter for water. After, then we have to set up FiO2. FiO2, the goal of setting FiO2 is we need at least 93 to 95% of SpO2. Hence, the FiO2 should be set in such a way that we are getting the saturation of at least 95%. Then after the settings, we should reduce that. After this setting, we should reduce the tidal volume by 1 ml per kg until we reduce the tidal volume to 6 ml, 6 or 4 ml per kg predicted body weight. Then let us see about the goals. We have 3 goals while maintaining the ARDS patient. What are those 3 goals? First, oxygenation goals, plateau pressure goals, and pH goals. In the oxygenation goals, in the ABG, we can appreciate a PaO2. Our goal should be to maintain the PaO2 of about 55 to 80 millimeter mercury, or saturation of 88 to 95 millimeter mercury. To achieve this oxygenation goal, we may use either of the 2 strategies. First strategy is lower PEEP or higher FiO2. Second strategy, high PEEP or low FiO2. Among these, higher PEEP, lower FiO2 is a better accepted strategy because ARDS is alternative system, the lungs that is minimally responsive to lower PEEP. So it is better to adapt higher PEEP, lower FiO2. We can see the FiO2 and PEEP settings according to the tables. But what should be kept in mind is that more we increase the PEEP, the more we are harming the patient. Increase in the PEEP decreases cardiac preload, afterload, and cardiac output, which in turn decreases blood return to the major organs, which in turn result in the which may lead to multi-organ dysfunction like that. It is better to keep in mind lung protection strategy of ventilation, that is higher PEEP or lower FiO2. So we should keep in mind. Then next goal is plateau pressure goal. We have seen about oxygenation goal. Second goal, plateau pressure goal. The plateau pressure, we should maintain plateau pressure to less than 30 centimeter water. First, after we can finish the initial settings. If there is any increase in plateau pressure more than 30 centimeter H2O, then we should decrease the tidal volume by 1 ml per kg. If the plateau pressure falls below 25 centimeter H2O, then we should increase the tidal volume by 1 ml per kg. Also, we should look for breathtaking or dysynchrony, which was dealt in detail by the previous speaker. For this also, we should increase the tidal volume by 1 ml per kg, and also to increase the duration of the expiratory time. That is to change the inspiratory-expiratory ratio from 1:1 to 1:2 or 3. Then pH goal, third goal. We have to maintain a pH of about 7.30 to 7.45. If there is a fall in pH below 7, we should correct it by keep in mind that we should not increase the respiratory rate above 35 per minute. Then if it is unresponsive, then pH fall drastically to 7.5. Then in addition to increasing the respiratory rate, we may have also to increase the tidal volume about 1 ml per kg. But if that also not responsive, we should consider giving soda bicarb infusion. If the ABG is little more, that is pH greater than 7.45, then we should decrease the PCO2 by decreasing the ventilatory rate. So we have seen the 3 goals: oxygenation goals, plateau pressure goals, and pH goals. And we should keep in mind that the duration of the inspiration should be less than or equal to duration of the expiration. We have finished the first part, that is ventilator settings and management. Then we are coming to the wean part, second part. Here, after managing the patient, we should try to extubate the patient, try to wean the patient. So before weaning the patient, we should look whether this patient fit these criteria. That is PEEP or FiO2, the patient receiving PEEP or FiO2 less than or equal to the values of those he was receiving the previous day, and FiO2 less than FiO2 less than or equal to 40%, peak less than or equal to 8%, or FiO2 less than or equal to 50%, peak less than or equal to 5 centimeter H2O. Then patient should have acceptable spontaneous breathing effort, and tidal volume should be at least greater than 4 ml per kg of related body weight, and he should maintain his systolic BB greater than 90 millimeter mercury without any vasopressor support, no sedation or no neuromuscular blocking agents to be administered before conducting this, before being the patient or before conducting SBT, that is spontaneous breathing trial. So before spontaneous breathing trial can be extended up to a period of 120 minutes, but we may consider extubation of the patient if he is well tolerated, SBT is well tolerated for at least a minimum of 30 minutes. So if the patient is ready for bleeding, we should place the patient on TP with CPAP less than or equal to 5 centimeter H2O. Then we should assess for the tolerance of the patient. To check for the tolerance, first thing we should notice SpO2. SpO2 should be greater than or equal to 90%, and ventilated tidal volume. Tidal volume should be greater than 4 ml per kg predicted body weight. Respiratory rate and effort should be minimum, that is less than or equal to 35 per minute. There should be no acidosis in the patient. Because greater than or equal to 7.3, no signs of respiratory distress. These are the signs of respiratory distress: either tachycardia, heart rate greater than 120% of the baseline, and marked use of accessory muscles of respiration, then diaphoresis and dyspnea. If the patient is well tolerated for 30 minutes, we may consider extubation. Thank you, sir. Hello, sir. Hello, sir.
Hello, thank you, Dr. Vignesh. Presentation, but because it's a very big topic and you have done fairly a good job within the short time. So now, any questions you can ask the speakers. And this is a small group discussion, so I want the speakers to either answer now or take the question present in the next class. But we'll give 10 minutes in the next class for the first 10 minutes, so that you can go read and come and discuss. Okay? So I just want the participants to participate now and pose questions to the 5 speakers.
Can I ask one question, sir?
Yeah, sure, sir, sure, please.
Yeah. For the COPD presentation, what are the criteria to straight away go into invasive ventilation when you have 2 options, both non-invasive and invasive? What are the criteria to initiate invasive ventilation? And if you have already started on a non-invasive ventilation, what are the criteria to move on to invasive ventilation? At which point you will decide, yes, it's time to go ahead with invasive ventilation?
Yes, sir. Sir, actually, if the patient, I mentioned about patient selection criteria for NIV. So if any of the factors are not there, if the patient is in severe, 1 second, so let me share, shall I share the screen again, sir?
Yes, doctor.
Is a patient selection for NIV, patients with respiratory distress with severe hypoxemia or hypercapnia, or when the respiratory failure is not an immediate threat to life or no life-threatening circulatory disorder, or the patient is fully awake, cooperative with intact airway reflexes, and there should be no recurrent vomiting or no facial anomaly. So if the patient doesn't fit into these criteria, we can go for invasive ventilation. Or if with non-invasive ventilation, the patient is still having hypoxemia or he is not able to clear out carbon dioxide, we can go for invasive ventilation.
So when the patient goes for a carbon dioxide narcosis, when the patient's level of consciousness is not fit enough or clear enough to hold the mask. For NAV, you cannot put a patient who is totally apneic or put a patient who is unconscious. We need some amount of patient to start stimulating. Okay, patient should start some amount of breath. And if the carbon dioxide level is going to go very high, so it is going to depress the central nerve. Initially it stimulates, then it will start depressing. At that particular time, you cannot continue with non-invasive ventilation. You may have to go in for invasive, so that you will take, because invasive ventilation will be able to remove carbon dioxide much better than the non-invasive ventilation. The early stages, non-invasive will be better. Once a patient goes to a stage where the patient is not able to maintain the PaCO2 level, the PaO2 level, you may have to go in for invasive. Sir, your comments, sir.
Yes, sir. Excellent, sir. This is to highlight for all the postgraduates or the participants. This is a very practical decision-making point. As she has slightly pointed out, sharing her slide once again. So this is always to be remembered. And Sir has highlighted the very basic principle: CO2 narcosis should always be kept in mind. And second thing is, in the previous lectures also we had raised some doubts, and the response to which with supporting literature evidence. PGs are supposed to come out with the answers during this session, or they can share it in our SDL group also. Like today, we had a question: amount of CO2 needed to produce pulmonary problems.
This is a group where PGs has to interact. Myself, Dr. Kamaksha, are only facilitators. So we are just giving you a topic for you to just go read, get enlightened. And if you're not able to answer, don't worry. You are only a postgraduate. Okay, nobody knows everything in anesthesia or intensive care. So when some question is asked, you try to answer. If you're not able to answer, collect the proper answer and give it back to the group, either through the chat, or you can put it in the SDL group, or if you want to prepare and talk, we will give you 10 minutes in the next class, because these classes are going to be a continuous class. So there you can just explain, because by explaining to a group, your knowledge will improve. Okay? And you are able to tell somebody, and a particular person is able to understand. For that, you have to read more. Okay? That is the reason why we are starting this. Okay, right. Whatever question that has been asked, you can always answer either next, or you can put the answer in your SDL group always there. Right. Any more questions?
Sir, what is the role of extrinsic PEEP in the treatment of auto PEEP, sir?
Extrinsic PEEP is a method by which the intrinsic PEEP is what the patient is having. Extrinsic PEEP is you give some amount of PEEP so that you keep the alveoli open longer. I mean, you keep the airway open for a longer period. What she said was you keep the time for a longer period. Now by keeping extrinsic PEEP, you can keep the airway open for a longer period. When the airway is open for a longer period, when during expiration, more gas will come out. When more gas will comes out, auto PEEP nothing but some amount of gas that stays inside the lung during every breath. By putting one external PEEP, you are trying to keep that tube open even during expiration, so that more gas will come out. So carbon dioxide will come out. So the intrathoracic pressure problem that are created by this auto PEEP will be reduced.
Sir, shall I add one more?
Yeah. Yes,
sir. So extrinsic PEEP actually opens the, it will decrease the work of breathing when the patient is inspiring. So the patient will have auto PEEP, so that will create a positive pressure, sir, compared to the atmosphere. So for inspiration, the patient has to generate negative pressure. So instead of generating negative pressure, we are giving a positive pressure from the atmosphere to deliver the breath, sir.
that is PST, pressure support. What he is asking is, how does PEEP help? extrinsic PEEP, the PEEP that you set.
Okay, sir.
Intrinsic PEEP is what the patient is able to generate because of the obstruction. Because the air is not able to come out, there is a positive end expiratory pressure. That is intrinsic PEEP. What he's asking is how does extrinsic PEEP helps in reducing your dynamic hyperinflation. By keeping some amount of external PEEP, it
Okay, sir.
most both adjust in such a way that there is time and there is flow of gases which comes out, so that dynamic in hyperinflation is reduced. Okay.
Thank you, sir. Sir, what are the various methods by which we can nebulize the patients intraoperatively?
Various methods by which I think she has already said.
Sir, she told only about metered dose inhalers.
But this talk, let us be very clear, this topic is not about ventilation, basics of ventilation. This talk is only about respiratory acidosis. We have selected few topics which are related to respiratory acidosis. That's why I have not asked them to go into depth, because if she goes into depth about COPD ventilation, it will take at least 1 hour. Okay, so there are various methods, like in the inspiratory limb, there are certain one-way valves through which you can put in your nebulizer canister and push. And there are certain methods where they say they have this 50 ml syringes. It will have a long temperature that can be put into the trachea, and your nebulizer puff, that we put into the plunger of the syringe will be taken off, and this your nebulizer will be put in, not your nebulizer, your puff will be put in that barrel of the syringe. And if you give 2 puffs and then give a positive pressure, they say the nebulized drug goes peripherally. And there are so many models that are available, which helps. Even certain ventilators have certain connections through which the nebulizer can go into the inspiratory cycle and enter the patient's lung, or the patient's airway. It depends upon what type of ventilator that you are using. I think we'll take one particular class about nebulization in ICU. I think Dr. Kamakshi can do that because they are good in intensive care, post-op intensive care. I think you can give the topic with some amount of live demos.
I'll discuss with my chief, Dr.
Kumar. Yeah.
This
is okay. I think few demos and the critical care will be useful for the students.
Yes, sir, definitely. Sir.
So if there are no more questions, I think we can end our class today. Next week I am not available, so next SDL will not be there on Saturday. Next Saturday we have a complete session on hydrocephalus, because the PTs wanted for the exams. So there will be one case presentation by MMC students about hydrocephalus. Before that, there are going to be 5 topics related to hydrocephalus. The PGs will be talking. So that will be on the 3rd Saturday of this month. So I'll give you the date and the speakers, etc., in a few days. Okay? So if there are no more questions, we'll leave. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Kamakshi.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much, sir.